Wow. Eddie said, try preaching after that. I'll do my best, but don't expect much. Wow, what a great day to be together. I'm so glad to see all of you here today for Hay Day. Now, I have a confession to make. I feel like I have to make this every now and then. You know, I wasn't born in the South, but I got here as fast as I could. I'm originally from Dayton, Ohio, and hay in Dayton is something you feed the cows. And we don't eat grits, we eat cream of wheat. But I've learned to eat grits, and I've learned to say y'all. So I feel like I've been here long enough over these years that I hopefully fit right in, but it is good to be together. Good to see all of you. If you're new to Aspire, we don't always say hey and wear flannel and blue jeans, but every now and then we do, just to get in touch with our roots a little bit. But we're glad you made it today. We started a brand new series last week called Leading from the Gap. And in this series, we're specifically looking at situations and circumstances that if you have lived any length of time, you will find yourself in, where you are expected to lead in situations that are less than ideal. And so we said, well, what does the Bible show us? What can we learn from the Bible about leading in these situations? Where can we go to learn about how to lead in these imperfect circumstances? So last week, we started out by looking at Moses. And Moses, you know, we think about Moses as this great deliverer. But in fact, before Moses was ever called by God, Moses was pretty much a mess. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation before where you thought, man, I'm not prepared to lead. I'm not the person to lead. I'm not qualified to lead. But we learned from Moses last week that when we lead through the gap of our inadequacies, God's grace is sufficient for us. God's grace is made perfect in our weakness. And so God asks us to come not in our perfection, but he asks us to come just as we are, even with our weakness, and that God himself, his grace, will make up the difference. Now, next week, we're going to look at Esther, and I love the book of Esther, and we're going to talk about how do we lead in the middle of a crisis. And then the last week of the series, we're going to look at a New Testament hero that we don't talk a lot about, but his name is Barnabas. And we're going to talk about how do we lead beyond ourselves? How do we lead in such a way that when we're gone, there will be people who carry on those things that are important. But this week, we're going to talk about one of the most famous characters in the Bible, a man named David. He was said to be a man after God's own heart. And we're going to learn from David, how do we lead when we're not in charge? Now, I was thinking about this in my own experience back towards times growing up. How many of you remember when you had to do a group project in school? Anybody ever have to do any group projects? Yeah. How many of you liked group projects? Okay, we've got a couple. I really didn't like group projects very much, and maybe your group experience was kind of like my group experience in that sometimes I'd be in the group and the person who was leading the group or said they were going to do something didn't do what they said they were going to do, and then you got to figure out who's going to do that thing. So whether you had to lead in a situation in a group project and you weren't supposed to lead, or whether maybe it was a situation at work and your boss was unavailable, or your boss just was falling down on the job and you found everybody looking to you to figure out what to do, or maybe it's a situation in your home. I grew up in a single parent home, and so when I found myself in charge of my sister quite a bit when I wasn't necessarily her parent, but I had to be the one in charge. Whatever the situation, we all find ourselves through life being expected to lead when we are not in charge. How do we do that? And I think David gives us a pretty good example of how to lead when we're not in charge. Now, when we think about David, we always think about David as King David, the great king, the greatest king of Israel, a man after God's own heart. But he wasn't always king. He wasn't always in charge. He wasn't always the man. In fact, we learn a lot from David before he became king. David knew what it meant to be overlooked. David knew what it meant to be pushed aside. David knew what it meant to be in a position where the person who was in authority was out to get him. And yet, in those circumstances, David stayed a man after God's own heart. And so the best leadership lessons, I think, that we get from David come from before he was king. So today I want to look at 3 specific scenes from David's life and see what they can tell us about how do we lead when we're not in charge. How do we lead when we're not the person who has the authority? And so we're going to look at these 3 specific scenes, but each one of them tell us this, that leading when you're not in charge requires humility, and then we're going to see that it requires faith, and finally we're going to see that it requires meekness. Humility, faith, and meekness. How to lead when you're not in charge. You're going to need all three of those. Let's look at each of them in David's life and how these things filled in the gaps. The first one is humility in the gap. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Now, David was not the first king of Israel. The first king of Israel was a man named Saul. And Saul was in this position of leadership and authority, but he was not a very good king. In fact, God had said that he was going to take the kingdom away from Saul and he was going to give it to someone else. He was going to give it to a new king. And so he called on the prophet Samuel, who was the last judge of the nation of Israel. He was the person everybody was looking to for leadership. And God said to Samuel that he was going to anoint a new king. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, it says this: "The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king from among his sons." And so Samuel goes to Jesse's house. And Jesse's got these sons, and all these sons line up and they appear to Samuel to see if they're the king. And the first one, Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, and Samuel looks at him and thinks, this gotta be the guy. He's this big, handsome, strong young man, the oldest of Jesse's sons. And in this tradition, the oldest son was always the one who inherited the mantle of leadership and inherited the majority of the father's wealth. And so Samuel's looking at him thinking he's the one, but God said no. And this is what God said in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the what? On the heart." Now, this is really important because the reason Saul was king is he was head and shoulders above everybody else. He looked like a king. And here, Eliab, Jesse's oldest son, also looked like a king. And so Samuel was about to anoint him king because of the way he looked. But God says, I don't look on the outward appearance. I look on the heart. I judge people by what is going on the inside of them. Now, we make decisions all the time based on what we see in the appearance of people. This person looks like a leader. They may even act like a leader. They may even put themselves in a position of a leader. But God says, I'm not impressed by any of that. I look past all of that to look at the heart. And one of the things that God is looking for, and we're going to see this, especially in just a few minutes, is the humility. And so Jesse presented 7 of his sons to Samuel, but God rejected every single one of them. And then Samuel said to Jesse, verse 11, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, there remains yet the youngest. But behold, he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of the oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. Because man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And so David, who had been forgotten, in fact, his father even tries to say, oh, yeah, there's one more, but don't worry about him. He's just the youngest. He's the runt of the litter. He's out tending the sheep. You can forget about him. He wouldn't be the one. One of these other boys has to be the leader. It can't be David. And yet when David comes in, the Holy Spirit tells Samuel, this is the guy. And it says that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. Now, this doesn't mean that David is the king yet. In fact, it's going to be a long time before David becomes the king. But in this moment, God's Spirit is on him. There's something about David that is set apart. Even though he had been forgotten by his own dad and his family, as just the youngest who's out tending the sheep, God had not forgotten him. Humility is believing that God sees you when others have forgotten you. And one of the keys to leading when you're not in charge is remembering that God knows exactly where you are, and God knows exactly what's in your heart. And so even if other people have overlooked you, have passed by you, have rejected you, have even betrayed you, God knows exactly where you are. And God is looking at the condition of your heart. And when the time is right, God will put people in the positions of leadership that He has called them to. But He's seeking somebody who is after His heart. Humility never grasps for leadership. It waits patiently on the Lord, trusting that he will anoint and appoint the right leader at the right time. That God has a plan, and the plan goes beyond what we can imagine. See, David wasn't jockeying for position. David didn't even realize there was an opportunity for him to climb up higher in his own family, let alone to be the king of the whole nation. He was just out faithfully doing what he was called to do. He was tending the sheep. And in God's timing and in God's perfect plan, God was going to raise him to be a king. Humility is being fully available to God wherever and however he calls you. David was out doing his thing, tending the sheep, and that's exactly where God called him. That's exactly where God said, I can use somebody like you doing exactly what you do for my purposes. This is just like last week when God called Moses. Moses was in the desert tending sheep, and God said, this place where you are standing is holy ground. What's that in your hand, Moses? It's a staff. Lay it down, Moses. I can use you right where you are with what you have in your hand. And David, from the sheep field, God called him. I love what the psalmist says in Psalm 78, verses 70 through 72, as it looks back on David's life. This is how the psalmist chooses to describe the great King David. He says, God chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, Israel, his inheritance. With an upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. See, the thing that defined David's kingship was the same thing that made him a good shepherd. That he shepherded and he guided with a skillful hand and a loving heart. And so my question for you is, where are you? You may think, I'm not in a position of authority. I'm being overlooked. I'm being forgotten. And yet, I would say where you are right now in the condition of your heart matters a tremendous amount to the plans that God may have for you in the future. You may not be in charge, but leading from the gap means that you have the humility to recognize that God has not forgotten you. God has not overlooked you. That God can use you where you are, and that you don't need to feel like you need to grasp for leadership. Just trust the Lord. He will anoint and he will appoint those whom he has to put in charge. We need humility if we're going to lead when we're not in charge. The second thing we need if we're going to lead when we're not in charge is faith. We see this in chapter 17. Now, the Israelites were constantly at war with the Philistines, and they were out on two mountains battling each other. And they had called for one person, the greatest warrior from each army, to come down into the valley. And Goliath was the Philistines' best champion. He was 9 feet tall. And everybody in the Israelite army was terrified of Goliath. Nobody wanted to go out and fight him. Meanwhile, David's 3 oldest brothers are fighting with Saul with the Israelite army. And David's father, Jesse, is sending David back and forth to take supplies to his brothers. And so David goes to see his brothers in the army, and when he gets there, he looks and he sees this giant, Goliath, down in the valley who's saying all kinds of hateful things about the Israelites and the Israelites' God. And so David asks some questions. And Saul, meanwhile, has offered a great reward to anybody who will go down and fight Goliath. And David basically is the one who says that, hey, why isn't anybody doing this? He looks at his big, strapping, strong, oldest brothers and says, hey, guys, why aren't you going down and fighting this guy? And of course, his brothers mock him as the littlest brother. But in 1 Samuel 17:32, we see this. And David said to Saul, the king, remember, Saul's the one in charge. Saul's the person who should be going down there and fighting Goliath. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fall because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. In other words, David is willing to do what no one else will do, even though David is not in charge and David is not responsible. And what does Saul say? Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and that bear took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Sounds just like a 13 or 14-year-old boy, doesn't it? Pretty confident of himself, isn't he? But is it just confidence in himself? Or does he have confidence in something more? Is it just bravado? Or is David looking at this situation and saying, hey, there is nobody willing to stand in the gap right here. Saul, you should be doing it, but if nobody else is willing to do it, I will do what no one else will do. Not because I'm strong enough, not because I'm big enough, but because God has delivered the lion and the bear into my hands. And those are creations formed by his hand. This Philistine, this Goliath, is defying God. God will surely hand him over to me. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Now, we don't know what tone Saul used, but I just have a suspicion that he is smirking at this point. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword, Saul's sword, over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, this is so important, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch, and the sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, I love this, because what does Saul do? Saul says, well, if you're going to go fight Goliath, you need to wear my armor. You need to take my sword. Why? Because it's the best. I'm the king, and I've got the best armor, and I've got the best weapon. And if you're going to go fight their leader, if you're going to go fight their best champion, you need the material of the best we've got. Now, this only highlights the fact that it should have been Saul going down into the valley to fight Goliath. And Saul's thought is, if I'm not going to go, I will at least give my best weapons to this runt to go down and fight him. If he's got any chance, he needs my weapons. He needs my authority to do it. And so what does David do? David tries it on. He tries on the armor. He straps the sword on. But he realizes, this is not who I am. Who am I to wear the armor of the king? I'm not the king. Who am I to wield the sword of the king? I'm not the king. See, sometimes when we're called to lead when we're not in charge, we think we got to be somebody we're not. And David said, no, I'm not going to be someone I'm not. I'm going to be exactly who I am. And I trusted God with a slingshot and rocks, and I'm going to trust God now with a slingshot and rocks because that's who I am. I'm going to have faith in God. I'm not going to have faith in Saul's armor, in Saul's sword. Faith is believing and acting as if God is enough when you're not. That's what faith is. Believing and acting as if God is enough when you aren't enough. David knew he was not enough. And David knew that Saul's armor and Saul's sword were not going to make up the difference. God called him as a shepherd in the field, and David was going to stand in the leadership gap as a shepherd in the field with the same weapons that a shepherd would have. When you are called to lead when you're not in charge, it requires a tremendous amount of faith in God that he's enough even when you're not. And so by faith, David led even when he wasn't in charge. And he slayed Goliath. And you're going to look at that full story today in your small groups as you continue to talk about David and how we're supposed to lead when we're not in charge. But let's look at the final characteristics of how to lead when we're not in charge that we see in the life of David. We finally see in 1 Samuel 24, meekness in the gap. Now, Saul was incredibly jealous of David because after David slayed Goliath, guess what all the people were saying? Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. Suddenly, David is trending on social media, and Saul has fallen off the radar screen. Nobody's paying attention to Saul anymore because David is now the one that's got everybody's attention. Because David was willing to do what Saul and no one else was willing to do, and he killed Goliath. And so Saul is incredibly jealous of David, and he even began to hate him, and he tried to kill him. And so David is fleeing from Saul, and several other people have fled from Saul as well because Saul is a tyrant and a terrible king. And so they're all fleeing from him, and Saul begins to pursue David. And we see in 1 Samuel 24, verse 1 through 3, this encounter. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats rock. And he came to the sheepfold by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself, like you have to do every now and then. So I just want you to get this picture with me for a minute. David and his men are running from Saul. Saul has heard where they are. He's got the information. He's on his way to find them. And as they're going in around these caves, Saul needs to take care of business. But what Saul doesn't know is that David and his men are hiding deep inside that very cave. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost part of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.'" Now, I would say this is probably one of the most critical crossroads in David's entire life. Because at this moment, his men are telling him, God said this time would come. And now's your chance. Now's your chance to take the leadership from this evil king, this man who's trying to kill you, this man who's pursuing you. God's delivered him into your hand. God set this up. It must be God's will for you to take the mantle of leadership. What is David going to do? Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. And afterwards, David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." Now this is fascinating, because if anybody had the reason and the right to kill Saul, it was David. And yet what does he say? I can't do it. Because even though Saul's a terrible king, he is still the Lord's anointed. And I have faith and trust that the God who called me from the sheepfold will be the same God who puts me in the throne when it is his time, not when I make time. And so David did not strike the Lord's anointed. David, who was the anointed to be the next king, did not strike the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, "My Lord, the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the earth and paid homage. This is a beautiful example of meekness. See, if you're going to lead when you're not in charge, you need humility, you need faith, but you also need a word we don't use a whole lot, and that's meekness. A lot of times people confuse meekness with weakness, but meekness is not weakness. Meekness is strength under control. It's the image of a horse under a bridle. A horse that is stronger than the man who is riding the horse, but whose strength is under control and being directed. And David was just that kind of man. He had the power, he had the ability, he could have taken the throne for himself, but he didn't do it because he was exercising meekness. In fact, Jesus said this about meekness in Matthew 5:5. "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now think about that for just a minute. When we think about people inheriting the earth, we think about military conquerors. We think about great politicians, powerful armies. It is the strength that will control the earth, that will inherit the earth. But God says, no. It will be the meek. Not people who are weak, but people who are strong and whose strength is submitted and surrendered to me. Those are the people who will inherit the earth. Oh, there may be evil kings in charge right now. There may be a boss who's unethical in charge right now. There may be somebody who is in charge right now who doesn't care, and you don't understand how they assumed that position. But your strength and your ability to keep that strength under God's sovereign hand is critical if you're going to lead when you're not in charge. Jeffrey Wilson said this: "Meekness is the mark of a man who has been mastered by God." And we need more people in the world today who exercise meekness, not weakness, but strength fully surrendered to God, who are humble enough to recognize that God will see them and God will put them in positions of authority in God's time, and to have the faith to believe that God is enough even when they're not. When we look at King David, I can't help but think about a better example of all of these qualities in Jesus. Because Jesus is the ultimate example of somebody showing us how to lead in the gap. That Jesus himself set aside all the rights and privileges and powers of God, and he stepped into the gap of our broken world. He surrendered himself to the powers and authorities of this world to free us from their grip. Jesus is the best example of humility. He's the best example of somebody who served faithfully, and he's the best example of meekness. Like David, Jesus was overlooked. Like David, Jesus was forgotten. Isaiah 53:3 says this: Jesus was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Like David, Jesus stepped into a battle that was not his to fight a fight that those who were in the battle could not win. Like David, Jesus who possessed all authority and power of God, did not regard his power as something to be used against us. Instead, he humbly surrendered himself to the cross for our salvation. And so my question for you as we consider how do we lead when we're not in charge is just asking you a few simple questions for you to wrestle with this week. Are you right now, in whatever situation you're facing, are you feeling overlooked? Are you feeling forgotten? Are you feeling neglected? Because you need to know today, God has not forgotten you. You may think everybody in your family and your older siblings have forgotten you, your spouse, your kids have forgotten you, and you've been left in the sheep gate. But God knows exactly where you are. He sees you just as you are, and he can use you right where you are, not because you're enough, but because God is enough. Are you confronting a Goliath right now? A giant that's waging war, that's taunting you? Let me ask you, what has God placed in your hand? Stop trying to be somebody you're not. Stop trying to use weapons that aren't yours to use. Instead, look at what God has already put in your hands and have faith that God has equipped you with everything you need from him in order to achieve the victory. Not through your strength, but through his strength made perfect in your weakness. Are you in a situation where you have the ability to take control, but you feel that God is asking you to trust him by surrendering control? I don't know what your life is like right now. I don't know where you might feel the pressure of having to lead when you're not in charge. But I want to challenge you as you leave here today to identify a situation where you are not in charge, but where God may be calling you to lead anyway. How can you have the mind of Christ in that situation? How can you exercise humility? How can you lead through meekness? What does faith look like in that situation? And I'm not asking you to do this so that you'll be like David, as great a man as David was, a man after God's own heart, as great a king as he was. I'm asking you to do this because we follow Jesus. And this is how Jesus lived. This is how Jesus led. And this is how he's calling us to serve and to lead even when we're not the people in charge. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads and pray. We're going to sing one more song, and as we do, maybe God's speaking to you about a specific situation right now. A situation where you are frustrated because the person who is in charge isn't leading. Maybe that's a family member, maybe that's a boss. But right now, I just want you to invite the Holy Spirit to ask, how can I be a man, be a woman after your own heart, God, in the middle of this situation? What would faith look like in this gap?